Ready for the 20-second clock.
Being recorded.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to participate in SEMA's Emerging Trends and Technology Networks webinar on regulatory navigation for the automotive aftermarket. Like the title says, today's session will focus on regulatory changes that have occurred in the last year and potential changes that could be implemented in the next few years. In addition, it will highlight any changes in enforcement activity experienced and expected from both our favorite agencies in EPA and CARB. Next slide, Peter. My name is Christian Robinson. I'll serve as your friendly moderator for today's session. A little bit about myself. I am SEMA and PRI Senior Director of State Government Affairs. I come from a political campaign background where I have over 20 years of experience in politics, and I've been with the association for over 13 years now. Time flies when you're having fun. My title, like it suggests, I monitor and activate on SEMA's and PRI's state government affairs efforts in the capitals in all 50 states, and with regulatory agencies like CARB, doing the blocking and tackling whenever we have an issue that pops up in one of those states. Before we get started today, want to introduce that we have a couple of polls that we're going to be asking you to participate in during today's session. And if you have any questions for myself or any of the panelists that we have joining us today, please use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. All right, next slide. All right, I will kick things off with our first panelist. We're pleased to be joined today by Mike Major. Mike is an attorney and engineer who brings a unique combination of legal, technical, and regulatory expertise to compliance issues facing manufacturers and suppliers. Mike is the founder of Powerful Compliance, LLC, where he advises OEMs, automotive manufacturers, distributors, and fleet operators on regulatory strategy, emissions compliance, and market access. His work spans interactions with agencies including US EPA, the California Air Resources Board, the US Department of Transportation, and international regulatory bodies across Europe, Canada, and China. Early in his career, Mark served as the manager at Kohler Engines Global Power Group, where he led regulatory compliance and sustainability initiatives across international teams. And he also worked as a performance development engineer at Toyota Racing Development. He holds a mechanical engineering degree and a law degree from the University of Wisconsin. Mike, what can you tell us about current enforcement activity from both EPA and CARB and how it's impacting the industry?
Hey, thanks for the introduction, Christian. I'm happy to drop in. And before I get to the slides, I look forward to your questions. I look forward to feedback, and I'm really happy for this opportunity to speak to SEMA members. Peter, if I can get the next slide, please. So my practice is really focused on maintaining market access. And through that, I serve manufacturers and retailers and distributors who are at risk of losing market access. One of the ways they can lose it is with a devastating penalty. Another way, though, is through injunctive relief or enforcement scrutiny. In the last 2 to 3 years, there has been movement, or there have been new justices on the Supreme Court. There has obviously been a significant shift at EPA. And my goal is to maybe redescribe the minefield that we are all operating in. Reality check the relief. I've had several clients call me and say, Mike, thanks for working with us. We don't need you anymore. And then 3 months later, I get the call back saying, hey, are you still available to work with us? Because it turns out things look kind of similar as they used to. I represent a lot of parties, or many parties, in front of EPA and CARB. I'm quite familiar with their current enforcement approach, so I'd like to share some of that. and then I will transition to some of the higher level or broader concepts of policy and authority updates, what best practices you should employ or should at least consider, and how to position yourself to defend from enforcement actions. Next slide, please. Great. So this is my second Trump administration, as it is for all of us, but it's the second one that I've been defending regulated entities in front of the EPA. And both times, the second time it wasn't as earth-shaking for me as it was the first time, but really the question was, like, do we still have an EPA? Do these regulations still matter? Are they still enforcing? And the EPA leadership is largely political, but Supreme Court developments, while their origin may be political, they apply into perpetuity. And we had there was a series of decisions, and there are more than the ones I've listed here, that really seemed to change the basis for EPA enforcement. The first, and I think most significant EPA-related case of the last 2 decades is probably Loper-Bright. Loper-Bright overturned the Chevron doctrine, and the Chevron doctrine recognized an agency's interpretation if the law, the Clean Air Act, was ambiguous. So the Clean Air Act has far fewer words than the regulations that cover your product categories, and courts generally deferred to the agency EPA interpretation. Loper-Bright overturned that Chevron doctrine. So that really felt like, okay, maybe this is a significant change. Maybe EPA will only have authority or at least energy to pursue those cases that are clearly in violation of the Clean Air Act. Another case that was decided, I think in 24, was the Jarkissi case. The Jarkissi case did not stem from EPA enforcement. It rather stemmed from an SEC matter. And the Jarkissi case that held that a defendant has the right to have a jury establish a penalty rather than an administrative law judge. And the reason that's significant is that most EPA cases do not go in front of a jury. Most EPA cases are settled, enforced, investigated, and settled on a administrative pathway. And it wasn't clear whether that would remain. In the last 2 years, I can assure everyone, or I shouldn't say assure, because you do have, Jarkissi opened up your right to demand a jury case. But what I've seen with my clients is that we would much rather face the more predictable, lower cost, and of providing greater opportunity to influence the outcome administrative framework than demanding a federal jury trial. So Jarkissi strengthened your right to leave the administrative pathway, but practically, there are few manufacturers who would rather face a federal court than proceed down a relatively very low-cost administrative pathway. So between Loper-Bright and Jarkissi, I think they're impactful rulings. And they may impact the largest OEMs, the Caterpillars and Fords and Hyundais of the world. Even though all of them are choosing to stay within the administrative pathway, I don't think these are relevant to SEMA members. Can I get the next slide, please? Then more recently, under the second Trump administration, DOJ tweeted, or whatever X it's called, it's a kind of posture by tweet that they were no longer going to be pursuing criminal charges under the Clean Air Act. This is this gave a lot of regulated entities false confidence because the DOJ and EPA rely on civil penalties rather than criminal prosecution in the vast majority of cases. What this was, in my eyes, more a reflection that DOJ was not very effective at fighting local politics, local shops, and really sympathetic defendants that don't have an ability to pay. And EPA, in my experience and in the regulatory trends, they claim they brought over 1,000 settlements. Of the hundreds of settlements that were resolved through EPA headquarters, only about 10% of them included Clean Air Act-based criminal charges. There were other criminal charges brought under wire fraud and customs regulations and laws, but not necessarily under the Clean Air Act. So while this is maybe a signal of a more reasonable and a more favorable EPA DOJ posture, I don't think it's going to, I don't think it reflects actionable and meaningful relief for the folks on this call. So can we get to the next slide, please? All right. And then very recently, about a month ago, the EPA rescinded the greenhouse gas endangerment finding. The endangerment finding was the justification for EPA regulating greenhouse gases. These are not the criteria pollutants under which most aftermarket cases are brought. These are primarily it's CO2 in the form of fuel efficiency standards, and then a series of refrigerants and other commercial chemicals that also have a greenhouse gas potential. Interestingly, EPA relied on the Loper-Bright ruling to justify its rescission that previously and improperly EPA had regulated greenhouse gases because the Clean Air Act was silent and the Chevron doctrine allowed EPA to fill that silence with reasonable regulation. This tracks logically to me, this tracks philosophically to me with the court. Unfortunately, unless you are really focused in refrigerant supplies, it's unlikely to materially impact your business, although it is another signal of EPA and DOJ's more favorable posture towards this industry. Could I get the next slide, please? So overarchingly, I experience EPA enforcement, my clients experience EPA enforcement and focus very similarly to how they did under the Biden administration and under the first Trump administrations. And I still perceive a substantial risk to aftermarket component manufacturers. That doesn't mean that you are blind until caught. There are definitely proactive measures you can take. The first one, and I think this is one where SEMA should get a lot of credit, is that EPA and the trade associations have worked to develop guidelines, guidance documents, and provide training in this and also on-site opportunities to avoid allegations of violations. The second thing, and this probably won't come as a surprise, is it's very important for regulated entities to be aware of their product offering, to be aware of what you're drop shipping, to be aware of what you're offering on your website, on your platform stores, and really perform a risk cost benefit of likelihood of adverse regulatory action against benefit that your business perceives and make an informed product selection or product offering decision. I work for manufacturers and vendors ranging typically from about 5 million in annual revenue up to a little over a billion. My sweet spot are entities that have somewhere between 50 million and 100 and 200 million in revenue. What every one of them that I work with wishes they had done is commissioned me to come out before they got that first notice from EPA or from CARB or from any other regulator. Compliance efforts are tax deductible, penalties are not. Compliance efforts are paid on your schedule, penalties are not. Compliance efforts can be scaled to your needs, penalties typically cannot. So if you have risks, if you are concerned, like this is the right time to do it before you get that notification letter. EPA and SEMA have also co-developed guidance that EPA offered. I think the reasonable basis guidance and policy is very actionable for SEMA members. It is, however, very important that you establish that reasonable basis before offering those components or products for sale. Also, review your target applications. This is such an easy one. This is one that I've seen a lot of suppliers get in trouble for, where they'll have data to establish reasonable basis for one application, but sell in broader markets than that reasonable basis would support. So that's a pretty easy one. All right, and then if you would, okay, get the next slide, please. Um, and then lastly, should you be facing the wrath of one of the regulators, these are in order the defense strategies and considerations that I work through with my clients. First and most importantly is the agencies will cast an extremely wide net, and it is to your benefit to refine and limit the scope of their investigation. Otherwise, you may spend millions of dollars just on discovery, just on document production, unnecessarily when those products may not be Clean Air Act relevant. Always provide timely support. One of the benefits of limiting the engagement is not just limiting your legal fees, but it's also limiting the legal fees that EPA will try to recoup through a settlement. EPA will tell you that they don't recoup legal fees and their expenses through settlement. That is not consistent with my experience. EPA under this administration has significant flexibility to recognize ability to pay relief. And so I encourage you to invoke that early. You should also self-develop for your expectations what your penalty tier would be and what the penalty total would be for the scope that EPA and or CARB are pursuing. Present valid defensible positions, you would do that. I've been able, in the last few settlements, we've been able to reduce the penalty amount by more than 80%, more than 90% in some cases, by thoughtful and targeted challenges to the enforcement action. So definitely encourage you to do the same. And this is a repeat from the last slide, but maintain reasonable basis, particularly for sensitive products. Anything that goes on a diesel engine should be supported by reasonable basis. I've already gone over my time, so I'm happy to pass the baton to Peter, who will help support how you establish that reasonable basis.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Given the potential harm enforcement can bring on a business, SEMA encourages its members to pursue compliance for their products. We'll turn now to what you can expect when working in this arena. And for that, we'll hand things off to Peter Tridy. Peter has been active in the automotive aftermarket since 1986. beginning his career building four-cylinder Ford racing engines at Esslinger Engineering. He later joined Gale Banks Engineering, where he developed expertise in diesel engines and began working closely with the California Air Resources Board, gaining firsthand experience with emissions regulations that impact aftermarket manufacturers. In 2014, Peter joined SEMA to establish the industry's first emissions compliance center, the SEMA Garage, providing emissions testing services and helping manufacturers navigate CARB's applications and regulatory communications. Today, Peter serves as the powertrain and compliance specialist with Automotive Consulting Services, LLC. Uh, Peter, you work closely with CARB and the companies that rely on executive orders. What are some of the challenges that this audience might face, and what are your recommendations for overcoming them?
Sure. Thanks, Christian, for the introduction, and we're definitely gonna cover that area here. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm a little concerned about my bandwidth, so I am gonna shut off my video today while I'm presenting, just to make sure that we maintain connectivity here. Yeah, I really appreciate, Mike, what you brought, some of the information that you brought here today. And it definitely relates closely to some of the things that I want to talk about. And when it comes to compliance, and I'm really glad, Mike, that you pointed out the terminology reasonable basis. We're gonna, reasonable basis is a very important area to focus, or way to focus your efforts when it comes to compliance. And so when you look at what your options are, first of all, you could choose to be non-compliant. You could choose to ignore the Clean Air Act and the California Vehicle Code and just sell your products without putting any effort into to emissions compliance, which we know that there are people that make that choice, and they take that risk. The concern with that is that is a high risk. And I think that as much as people have hoped that the Trump administration would do away with the need for compliance, or that the recent change in the greenhouse gas policies, or understanding of the greenhouse gas issue would change the regulatory landscape, that's really not the case. We have to be aware that the Clean Air Act is still in place, and there's still a need to remain in a compliant path. So it's really not, there's no safe harbor at this point. And as a manufacturer, you should be prepared to include compliance as part of your product development efforts. Non-compliance, of course, is low cost until enforcement happens. And I was interested to see that the difference in tax efforts, or taxation when it comes to compliance versus enforcement. Not to mention the other comments that Mike made about when those costs can hit you, and how you have control over your compliance costs, but you don't have control over your enforcement costs, and so forth. So you're dealing with it with kind of a high risk effort at that point. But that gives us two other paths to consider. One is compliance with the EPA regulations, and then of course there's CARB on top of that. When we think about EPA compliance, the thing that we want to really pay attention to is the tampering policy. Mike mentioned this document. This was came out in 2020. It provides us with clear guidance on how to be compliant with the Clean Air Act. And the nice thing about the tampering policy is it's essentially a self-certification process. Reasonable basis is used, that terminology is used throughout. And basically what that means is that if you have a clear and proper engineering justification for your product demonstrating compliance, then you have met a reasonable basis. And the tampering policy lays it out very clearly. There are multiple options that are available to demonstrate compliance. And I will say that there's some room for interpretation within the tampering policy, but it definitely leans heavily on the type of testing that that the OEMs do to certify their vehicles. And following the tampering policy means that it's your responsibility to provide a demonstration of compliance and to have that reasonable basis documented. The next step up from that is a CARB EO. And the CARB EO is really the most robust path that you can choose for emissions compliance. It can be costly or more costly than doing your due diligence with the tampering, under the tampering policy, but it's also the lowest risk. So the added cost that comes with relying on the CARB process, submitting applications to CARB and so forth, also ensures that you're going to come out of that process with the most robust defense in terms of compliance. Having a CARB EO will meets the EPA tampering, the requirements of the EPA tampering policy. There's the CARB EO is specifically mentioned within the tampering policy, but it also meets the requirements of the California Vehicle Code. So now you have the highest level of confidence you can have for selling products nationwide. It can be time consuming, and that's one of the drawbacks to the CARB EO process, but it also is one of the reasons why you want to make sure that you engage with people who understand the process and can help you through it so that you minimize the time involved. I want to talk a little bit about some of the current challenges with the CARB procedure. And again, I'm going to focus on the CARB EO process because that's the only process that is essentially a regulated process by a government agency that results in documentation or a government document that is the CARB EO. Everything that I say about the CARB EO process, there are elements of that that will apply to the EPA tampering policy as well. But the CARB aftermarket procedures are written clearly, but they are subject to internal interpretation and occasionally to policy changes within the department that handles aftermarket products. And this can result in difficulty when you're trying to understand, as an applicant, you're trying to understand the procedures. And sometimes you might interpret things differently than the CARB staff. So again, it's good to be clear and know what you're dealing with as you go into those procedures. When there's changes in policy internally at CARB, that can feel like a moving target. So knowing ahead of time what potential changes might be coming or that you might be faced with in interpretation of the procedures is important to know. The best way to combat those types of issues is with good communication. The more that you communicate with CARB staff, the more chance you have of knowing what to expect up front and resolving issues as they arise. The way the procedures are structured, there are multiple categories for different product types, and there's also a requirement that applications must be split into groups according to the vehicles that they fit, and specifically their weight classifications, the different fuel types, the emissions category that those vehicles are originally certified under, and the emissions equipment that are on the vehicles. And this makes it challenging for products that might have, say, universal fit. That becomes a big challenge. So again, that's where you really want to have some good communication with CARB on the front end. Right now, the transition between the 25 to 26 model years, we are seeing a correlating transition from Lev 3 to Lev 4. Lev 1, 2, and 3 and 4 are all kind of large categories that CARB uses to group vehicles for emission standards. And this transition from Lev 3 to Lev 4 will present some challenges as you, as an applicant, you're going to be faced with having to do additional applications and so forth. So just be aware of that right now, the transition from 25 to 26 model years brings with it this transition from Lev 3 to Lev 4. We also are seeing now the introduction of some gasoline particulate filters. Some of you will recall back in about the 2007 model year, we saw the introduction of diesel particulate filters. And this presented whole new challenges when it comes to compliance. We're going to start to see that again now with gasoline vehicles because particularly in California, the PM or particulate matter standards are getting tighter. And the way the OEMs, one way that OEMs are dealing with that is with these gasoline particulate filters. So it's going to present some new challenges. Upcoming soon, we're going to be experiencing some revisions to the CARB aftermarket procedures. The changes that they are considering are beneficial to our industry. I mentioned that applications have to be split up by specific categories. CARB is now considering consolidating some of those groupings. It may not make a huge change, but it will be beneficial in the long run. And the more of that kind of consolidation that we can experience, the better overall. Secondly, CARB is considering adding a feature to worst case vehicle selection. So if you've ever experienced the application process with CARB or having to test a vehicle, you know that CARB will select a worst case vehicle to represent a cross section of the vehicles that you're attempting to get your product fitment covered for. CARB is considering adding a feature that would expand that capability a bit. It's a little unclear at this point how much benefit that will bring to our industry, but in general, the concept is beneficial, and we have some high hopes for this being a good change for the industry. The third item that they are entertaining is what they're calling a conditional exemption. This is a situation where they may issue a temporary executive order or EO in situations where you have direct carryover from one model year to the next. The logistics behind this are very unclear at this point, and so it's hard to know exactly how this is going to play out. But a conditional exemption will be beneficial for situations where you have direct carryover from one model year to the next with your products, and should be beneficial in those situations getting to market a little bit quicker with those products. Finally, they're considering some changes to the labeling requirements. One of these is that they will no longer require that you provide a physical sample of your label, and they're considering a new numbering system. Again, the logistics behind the new numbering system is unclear at the moment. I honestly don't think that these changes are going to do much to make things much easier for our industry, but I do think it will make things simpler on the administrative side for CARB, which can benefit us in some ways. All of these anticipated revisions are going to be discussed in an upcoming workshop. CARB has not released a date for that workshop yet, but keep your ears to the ground. Stay tuned to your email, any emails you may get from SEMA. SEMA will definitely alert you once this happens or is scheduled to happen. I definitely recommend you participate in that workshop. That is your opportunity to speak into these things and push for these changes to be as useful and beneficial to our process as possible. A couple other little details that I'd like to mention here. Everything that I just talked about relates to the aftermarket procedures, and the aftermarket procedures cover the bulk of products that our industry is dealing with. It could be anything from cold air intake systems to supercharging kits, tuning devices, and so forth. There are a couple of carve-outs, though, that you need to be aware of that fall into other procedures that CARB has. And incidentally, this is also true for EPA. EPA has certain procedures set aside for some product types that would not fall under the tampering policy. And those include, but are not necessarily limited to, alternative fuel conversions, which would include alcohol fuels. In this case, the one that stands out to me the most is say a conversion from a gasoline vehicle to allow it to run on as a flex fuel vehicle on blends of ethanol. The other particular area is catalytic converters. Catalytic converters have their own requirements for approval, and so you need to follow those procedures specifically. Then a few final thoughts here. And Mike, I think you mentioned this as well. I think it's really important to consider compliance early in a product's life cycle. Don't wait until you're ready to sell the product before you think about emissions compliance. Plan early for that, so that you are ready to, when you get to the point of being ready to sell the product, you're compliant. You can be well along the path to compliance. Secondly, seek expert assistance, and this is something that I think is available. There are third parties that can handle assisting in this area that are expert in this area. The company that I work for included. SEMA has an entire department dedicated to this. So reach out to those groups to get assistance in this process. One way that I look at it is you can actually wind up saving yourself a lot of money and by allowing your engineers to do their engineering work and allow other parties to assist in the areas that are more challenging and just would wind up pulling your engineers off of their standard tasks. So, look for those that can help in those areas. Make sure you establish best practices. This extends beyond the product development area into training your people, your sales personnel, and not just internally, but through your distribution channels as well. But establish those best practices to avoid enforcement activity as much as possible. That's again something that outside experts can provide you, training materials, ways to plan ahead for those types of concerns. The last thing I'd like to mention is a while back, probably now going on a month ago, CARB sent out an email. Some of you probably received this, asking for input on the fiscal impact that your company would encounter if you were to be required to report on sales volume of aftermarket products. This is some of you probably looked at that and decided not to answer just because you didn't even want to consider that might happen. According to CARB, the aftermarket is one of very few areas that currently is not required to give sales reporting, where others are, such as OEMs, for example. OEMs have to report their sales volume to CARB. From my perspective, this is a heavy burden for our industry to have to endure. So I think that It's something that we don't want to see happen. However, the only way that CARB would really understand the burden that this would place on your company is for you to report that information to them via response to that email. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that and do that, I would recommend that you give them an honest answer on that, and give them the information that they're looking for at this point to address the situation right up front. And otherwise, that could become something very burdensome and become an added challenge that we really don't need. So with that, Christian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Really, before I get started, I want to echo what Peter said about participating in the regulatory process at CARB. SEMA will certainly notify the industry once they schedule the workshop that Peter mentioned. But if you are already on their mailing list for when they send out such notifications and you already receive it, wholeheartedly agree with Peter that you should feel free to participate in those workshop sessions. They're a great way for the industry to have its voice as they're crafting what will be the proposed regulations. So, when a topic like sales data reporting gets brought up during one of their workshops and PowerPoint presentations, you can be providing them live feedback on that topic as it's being workshopped. So it's easier to get things changed when you get in early in that regulatory process before they propose the actual printed language of the regulation. But as Peter mentioned, the CARB aftermarket procedures can be difficult to navigate, and there's all sorts of jokes that can be written about government and bureaucracy and how slow things are. And I focus on state legislative work primarily. We'll go ahead and advance the next slide, Peter. And one of the things that frustrates members that we hear of more than anything is how long it can take when working through the EO process to get a final EO received so that you can begin selling that product into California's market. We've responded to that this year. We've sponsored legislation in the California State Senate, SB 1069, that goes right to the heart of that issue. And just stepping back, if I had a time machine, a DeLorean that could go at 88 miles an hour, I'd go back to 2018. And that is when the industry agreed to start paying a fee for CARB EOs, something that used to be free, with the agreement that money would go towards the hiring and overhead to get more engineers on staff at CARB to turn things around faster so that products could be brought to market faster. Unfortunately, as we sit here in 2026, that has not necessarily been the case. At the SEMA garage, we've been working on some EOs that have been lasting over 24 months from when that application process started. So this is a very simple bill that's been introduced. And as it's currently written, it says that once the application is submitted, CARB has 30 days to review it and determine if things are in order. If they are, that starts another clock where there is a 60-day window for CARB to review that application and the test data and issue the EO. There's a second component to it, which is for CARB to start showing their work to the legislature. We compile our own data behind the scenes of looking at turnaround times for EO applications under the current procedures, the previous procedures, and this would require CARB to do the same thing every other year to lawmakers to see if this process is working, if tweaks need to be made. companies invest a lot of money. And, Peter talked about the applications and how sometimes there can be a number of breakouts that can cost, depending on the size of the company, $500 to $1,000 per breakout. That can add up very quickly. But it's not just that cost. There's the laboratory costs involved, the testing of the product itself, the staff that you've got to hire, and then the uncertainty of the ability to bring that product to market while you go through that bureaucratic process. So this bill goes right to that problem. It will have its first hearing in the legislature here in a couple of weeks on April the 8th in the Senate Environmental Quality Committee. I'll be making that fun trip from here in DC to Sacramento to testify on behalf of SEMA. And if you are a company that goes through the EO process for aftermarket parts, this is what that would impact. And you would like to support the legislative effort, we have a very easy way for businesses to sign on to a coalition letter that will go right to lawmakers. I think we're going to drop it in the chat for you. All you have to do is plug in your name, the name of the business, and where you're located, and you'll automatically be signed on to an industry letter. So, we hope that we can bring real change through the legislative process to get things moving a little bit quicker when it comes to things over at CARB. All right. I handle state issues. I want to bring in my colleague, Eric Snyder, who handles things on the federal side, because it's not just about state issues and things like CARB. SEMA is active at the federal level as well, where Eric is our lead. He oversees both legislative and regulatory affairs here in Washington, D.C. for SEMA. Before he joined our team, he worked in the administrations of former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and former President George W. Bush, and has experience working both statewide and federal political campaigns. He is also the incoming chair of the Small Business Legislative Council, which is an organization that represents over 25 national trade associations, including SEMA. He also holds a master's degree in legislative affairs from the George Washington University here in DC and a bachelor's of arts in business from Flagler College down in Florida. Eric, before I hand it off to you to talk about legislation that may impact the industry and some regulatory updates, we got a big election coming up this fall. Peter, if you could advance the slide. What are, Eric, some of the key races that you are looking at, some races that we might be supporting through SEMA's Political Action Committee that, could really tip the balance of power in November?
Yeah, no, thanks, Christian. It's no secret that both the House and the Senate are in play. This year, I think it's very likely that we may see, flip to Democratic control in the House of Representatives, and Republicans have a 3-seat majority in the Senate. So that's going to be close as well. Of the 33 Senate seats that are going to be up for re-election this year, I think about 25 of them are held by Republicans. So Republicans are definitely playing defense. We're seeing some major races, kind of starting in the Northeast, going from Maine. Susan Collins, longtime incumbent, is up for re-election, has some challenges there, potentially from the governor, and an upstart Democratic candidate, private businessman there. Down in North Carolina, we've got a Senate seat that is going to be open as a result of Tom Tillis retiring. He's running, the Republican candidate, Michael Whatley, former head of the RNC, is going to be running against Roy Cooper, former governor there. That's going to be an interesting one. Ohio is going to be another top-notch race. Former U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democratic nominee, will be running against a new U.S. Senator who's got a lot of ground to kind of make up. And then shifting gears, you've got some other states that are potentially in play as well. Iowa, open seat that could be interesting. And then going all the way up to Alaska, Dan Sullivan, incumbent Republican, faces a good challenge from former Congresswoman Mary Peltola. But those are the big ones that we're looking at and will potentially get involved with.
Yeah, I know you've already volunteered to go knock on doors up in Alaska in November for that race.
Yep.
But yeah, even if we shift away from the federal races for Senate and House, one that gets a lot of headlines and certainly would be applicable for this crowd when we talk about things like CARB is the California gubernatorial race. Gavin Newsom, everyone's favorite politician who seems to get a lot of headlines these days, is termed out. He served 2 terms, 8 years as governor of California, and he is 100% running for president in 2028. So you now have the governor's mansion up for grabs in California, and California is a very blue state. It is, you look at the legislature, you got a supermajority there of Democrats. But it's interesting. You've got a really huge field of candidates this year. A lot of Democrats have thrown their hats into the ring, and no one has really broken through yet to take that front runner mantle. And California's elections are interesting. They don't have in the primary a Republican primary and a Democratic primary. It's something called a jungle primary. So everyone's on the ballot. Doesn't matter what party you're in, you vote in June. And the top 2 vote getters advance to November. So it could be 2 Democrats, it could be 2 Republicans, it could be 1 Democrat, it could be 1 Republican. There is some concern right now, especially I think there's some Democratic operatives, political operatives losing sleep at night, that because there are so many Democrats splitting the field, that you could theoretically have 2 Republicans advance to the general election in November, because there are really only two Republicans that are running right now. The sheriff in Riverside, Chad Bianco, and TV personality. You've probably seen him on Fox News, Steve Hilton. So that's one to watch as we move into the summer months. We'll see what happens. But Eric, I'll let you take control here and tell us about any federal activities that could impact the aftermarket from an emission standpoint.
Yeah, no, thanks, Christian. Appreciate it. So I want to talk about kind of the end of electric vehicle mandates. And I say that tongue in cheek. Look, electric vehicles are going to be here to stay, but and that's not a bad thing. I'll say this: like SEMA has never been, we've never taken the side of one technology over another. But I think it was alarming to a lot of SEMA members, especially with so much of our industry making products that are contingent upon modifying vehicles with internal combustion engines. The whole idea of us, going to 100% or like 2/3, new vehicles sold as EVs in just a couple of years ago was really scary. And I want to talk about this just briefly. And earlier we talked about there have been a lot of major changes nationally, but over the last 14 months, I can't think of anything that's more impactful broadly on a lot of your businesses, than these end of EV mandates. And I'd say this: look, while EV mandates directly impact the automakers themselves, the indirect impacts are on those businesses, that need a product and need a long runway in terms of the products that they sell. You guys are probably familiar with a couple of years ago, California came out with their Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. This is something that really drew the ire of a lot of SEMA members. California's policy, which impacted not only California, but 12 other states that followed it, making up over 40% of the American population. These states embraced ACC2, which would have mandated an increasing sale of EVs each and every year up to 2035, at which point all new vehicles sold in California and those other states following California would have had to have been zero emissions vehicles. So in short, you couldn't have sold a gasoline vehicle. SEMA played a really integral role in defeating this policy. And the way we did this was actually at the federal level. The US EPA actually has to sign off on regulations like ACC2. At the end of President Biden's term, his administration, his EPA, granted California permission to do this. SEMA subsequently worked with Congress in order to pass a policy overturning that permission, which President Trump signed into law last July. So really exciting change, something that impacts over a third of SEMA member companies, over $100 billion in annual sales. And again, this is just about, allowing the best technology to win. I think as we see $4 gas through a lot of the country, and I guess which means $5 to $6 gas in California, it's probably going to make electric vehicles a little bit more attractive for a lot of people. And at the end of the day, that's a person's choice. What makes the most sense for them. Additionally, want to talk about another significant policy change on the EV front. The Biden administration had enacted tailpipe emission standards back in 2024 that would have governed model year 2027 through 2032 vehicles. Those policies were so stringent. And again, these didn't mandate a specific technology, but they were so stringent. The only way automakers could have met them was for 2 out of 3 of the new vehicles they sold in 2032 to be EV. This policy has been walked back, and it's been actually impacted by the endangerment finding that Michael talked about a bit earlier. I know we're getting pretty far into the program, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. Another notable change is that automakers are no longer subject to not meeting fuel economy standards. Just a couple of years ago, we had automakers paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for producing too many gas guzzlers, vehicles that weren't meeting these aggressive standards. And candidly, these standards baked in electric vehicles into them that were largely unrealistic. That's changed, and that's not just a Trump policy that can be revoked. That's actually federal law. That was changed in July of last year. And so I think we're going to see, and we are already seeing this. I'm like, more, V6s, V8s, exciting engine platforms, that the companies from Stellantis, Ford to GM are putting back in the mix, and, just a little bit of changes to product cycle. So I think, the runway for ICE vehicles, especially fun ones for enthusiasts to work on is looking really strong into the future. Again, already talked about the endangerment finding a little bit. And I think, again, this is important because there's a lot of news gets muddled out there. And Michael alluded to this as well. While this policy really impacts new vehicles first and foremost, there's a little bit of less direct impact on the aftermarket, which is, first and foremost subject to, criteria pollutants. You can't increase NOx. Your products can't increase those emissions compared to an OEM vehicle. And additionally, we want to just talk a little bit more about the Trump administration's policies favoring compliance assistance versus enforcement. Candidly, I worked in the Bush administration. I represented OSHA. Not that dissimilar. I think a lot of Democratic administrations, they're taking cues from environmental groups who want to see them closing on a lot of cases, significant number of enforcement actions. Look, enforcement is still taking place in the administration, but I think, as we all know, there's a long runway for that enforcement. And so when you look at the Trump administration's numbers at EPA for enforcement, in 2025, for that fiscal year, you saw over 2,100 enforcement cases, over $650 million in fines. Simply put, a lot of those actions were in place from the previous administration that they just, continued to see through. They didn't stop them in their tracks. And I think that's obviously a very reasonable policy. Additionally, EPA's enforcement policies resulted in the private sector making commitments that are going to cost their businesses over $6.5 billion. And that's to simply return, their businesses to compliance for the products they're selling. Finally, EPA issued a compliance memo back in early December, and this really highlighted that compliance assistance. It's using tools that they have at their disposal to work proactively with businesses, technical assistance, training for regulated communities, voluntary and self-compliance programs. And SEMA is working aggressively right now to get even more federal recognition for the SEMA certified emissions program. It's no secret that CARB EOs are, the process has been slowed, and we're obviously, Christian and the SEMA Garage are working aggressively to change that. But I think, having some federal recognition for the SEMA certified emissions program, which meets all of the same requirements as CARB EO, is a really good, durable, solution. And it's a good benchmark while folks are waiting for, for their CARB EO. At least gives them that 49 state, protections from enforcement. Finally, and again, Michael alluded to this, no criminal penalties for emissions tampering. We've seen about 10 or so cases where there was criminal enforcement in the aftermarket. Now, obviously, that doesn't just cover the specialty aftermarket. A lot of that was trucking. This policy change is definitely significant in that the administration is using their enforcement discretion. And I think it's important to know, though, that this is just this current administration's policies. There are statutes of limitations that extend, 5 years. So that goes into the next administration. So any kind of bad behavior, malfeasance, willfully violating the Clean Air Act, criminal penalties could be enforced in the future. And so, I think just being smart and, having that reasonable basis for what you're doing is obviously just so important. Christian, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. We're pretty much at the end of our time. I think Nicole put this in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, you've got all of our email addresses there on the screen. All right. Well, seeing none, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. And again, don't be strangers. If you wake up later and think of something that you want asked, we're happy to help.